Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree has some of the best and most difficult bosses that we've ever seen in FromSoftware's history. Today, we'll take a look at my top 10 bosses from the new DLC. Now, we'll be basing this ranking primarily on 3 key factors: the mechanics of the fight, the lore behind it, and the overall spectacle, taking into account the lead up to the fight as well as the boss arena. We'll kick things off at number 10 with the Putrescent Knight. This is an optional boss you can find at the end of the Stone Coffin Fissure dungeon, all the way down in the fissure depths. The Putrescent Knight is a pretty unique combo here, as he's a skeletal knight but also rides a horse that he can dismount from at any point in the fight. He wields a massive curved blade, and all of his attacks tend to be a bit slower with long windups. Key moves include a cleaver chop, a cleaver throw, and a devastating barrage of blue flames during its second phase. Now, this boss can hit pretty hard, but I think it's a pretty well-balanced and unique fight. I also enjoy the arena here, which has plenty of space to maneuver. One thing that frustrated me at first about this fight is something that I actually started to enjoy the more I fought him. And that's actually how he uses the mount in the fight. At times, he'll launch an attack while mounted, but he can also leap off and hit you with another attack, leaving the mount to charge in for a separate follow-up attack. We've seen FromSoftware try a number of duo-style bosses over the years that work together, but I think the Putrescent Knight is a unique twist on that formula. Moving on to number 9, I have Romina, Saint of the Bud. Romina is one of the few boss fights that are truly required in the DLC. You'll need to take her out to gain access to the final area. And honestly, considering how late in the game you'll probably fight her, I was expecting a bit more from this fight. She looks like a mix of a scorpion, centipede, butterfly, and human. She uses a spear, centipede fangs, and a scorpion stinger to attack, so at the very least the fight does feel pretty unique. She doesn't look too similar to bosses and enemies that we've seen before. Visually, I actually really like the look of her attacks and the overall boss design here. For being such a late game boss though, there's really not much of a spectacle here at all. There's no cutscene before the fight or during her phase change, and she also has no dialogue whatsoever. Now, difficulty shouldn't make or break the fight for a ranking like this, but I found this one pretty easy and actually took her out on my first try, even without summoning. First try, you've gotta be kidding me. Now, considering what lies ahead, maybe it's intended for this to be a more manageable, easy fight. At number 8, we have Messmer, Mother of Fingers. This one had originally started at number 10 on my list, but the more I thought about it and looked back at my footage, I decided to move it up a few spots. Why move it up? Well, first we have the lore, the arena, and just the lead up to this fight, which are all excellent. It is an optional boss that you'll only gain access to by going through Ramir's questline, one which has some pretty significant lore revelations throughout. The boss design is just classic FromSoftware here. It's so bizarre and grotesque, but totally fits within this dark and bleak world they've created. By the time you reach this fight, it probably won't prove too difficult as long as you stay away from the tail attacks, which can dish out some pretty heavy damage. Most of the attacks here are pretty straightforward to dodge, especially if you've made it this far into the game. Largely, you kind of know what to expect out of a large hulking boss like this. For number 7, I'm going with the Erdtree avatar, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed this boss. Maybe it's because I was stuck on Commander Gaius and wanted to just go do something else, and then instead I ran into this boss, which is a significantly more pleasant experience than fighting Gaius, at least in my opinion. The avatar usually attacks almost instantly with a move that sends a rush of thorns your way in 2 separate waves. This can really hurt if you get hit by both of them, and on the first few attempts I struggled to dodge because they're sent from so far away. You really have to look ahead and pay attention to when the avatar sends the attack your way and time the dodges just right. Once you get that down and can get in close, the attacks are pretty well telegraphed. It doesn't take long to see how you can do massive damage when attacking the head. The most unique component of the fight though is that it actually has 3 phases, all of which are hidden to you behind completely separate health bars. Each phase also introduces new attacks to keep the fight from getting stale. The second phase adds more speed to the giant sunflower, as well as this bull rush attack where it charges you 3 times. And the final phase adds a massive AoE explosion you have to make sure you get far away from, or you'll suffer heavy damage. This fight probably took me a bit longer than it should have, but I found it to be a pretty fun fight overall. There was something about learning its moves and timing the dodges just right that I found really satisfying here for this one. Now at number 6, we have what could potentially be one of my most controversial picks on this list. It's actually the final boss of the DLC, Radahn, Consort of Miquella. Now, I do have to say, I'm going to make a prediction right now, and it'll be interesting to see if this comes true or not in the coming months and years. But I'll say off the jump here, I think people will come to appreciate this boss more as time goes on. I know right now some are disappointed that the final boss is actually someone we've already seen and fought in the main game. Honestly, it didn't bother me much at the time, but I definitely can see and understand the frustration. Personally, I was super intrigued by the fact that we were going to be fighting a prime version of Radahn, now powered up by Miquella. As for the fight itself, this is where it gets tough, in more ways than one. I actually think the fight with Radahn in the base game is the more enjoyable and more epic fight overall. With this version of Radahn, the first phase of the fight is pretty well done. It's fun to learn his moves here and figuring out what can and can't be punished. I'll be honest though, on the first phase, I do think it's a bit too easy. The first part of the fight only took me a handful of attempts before I was able to reach phase 2. Now, of course, they more than make up for that with the difficulty and how intense things get in this second part of the fight. I think everyone's biggest issue with this phase is all about the massive AoE holy damage that he sends out here with seemingly every attack. There are multiple and frequent flashes of light all across the screen that can really make things difficult to see and keep track of his moves. He has many of the same combos from the first phase, but now the holy damage on the ground completely changes things. One of his most punishable attacks in phase 1 is the combo where he ends with the ground slam and then pulls up. I got to the point where I could dodge this pretty consistently in phase 1, but in phase 2, I just kept getting hit by this holy damage almost every time. I'm sure there's a way to avoid it, but I could never figure it out. I was basically tanking it every time and still going in for hits on him. Now, right now, at the time of me recording this, a lot of the conversation around this fight is about how it is the hardest boss FromSoftware has ever created. Personally, I'm about a week removed from beating Radahn without summons, and while he was definitely one of the hardest bosses I've ever faced, I still don't know if I'm ready to say he's harder than, say, Malenia. Her healing mechanic requires you to be so familiar with every move in her arsenal. With Radahn, I do think it's probably a bit easier to kind of brute force your way to a victory. I mean, like I was just telling you guys, there were some moves that I just had to go in and tank because I couldn't figure out how to dodge them, and I was still able to beat the fight even doing that. But the difficulty and where it ranks all time in that regard is probably a topic for another video. This video is focusing on the top boss fights overall, and now it's time to move into the top 5. Now, this is definitely where things start getting even more difficult for me to rank. With this next boss, from what I've seen online, I think I'm probably a bit lower on this one than many others, and it's Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. The whole lore behind the Frenzied Flame is obviously a huge win for fans of the story who really care about those details. The area leading up to this boss, known as the Abyssal Woods, has to be the most haunting area in all of the DLC. It even includes an enemy that you can only defeat with a parry or by sneaking past it. Wait, where's his health bar? Does he have a health bar? And maybe one of the more frustrating parts of this area is that you can't even use your horse here, which is kind of cool at first, but then once you defeat the boss, I kind of wish that limitation would lift and now we could take Torrent through here. But I do at least understand why they tried to do that. Then you have the dungeon itself, which is also pretty creepy as you steadily make your way through Midra's manse. Then comes the actual boss, and I have to say, there's inevitably a boss in every one of these games that takes me way longer to beat than it probably should. For this DLC, it was definitely Midra. While he's certainly creepy, his moves don't seem all that intimidating. Underestimate him though, and he'll punish you time and time again, and this is what kept happening to me. I mean, I felt like I had a good grasp on all his attacks, but for some reason I just kept losing. I kept underestimating. I kept getting greedy, as many of us tend to do. Depths of your foolishness! Of course, he's going to inflict the madness status effect, which adds another dimension to the fight that you have to account for. And I don't generally like having to switch between a bunch of items during a fight, so I opted to use talismans and armor to try and slow that madness build up here. His second phase is yet another awesome and seamless transition into a more intense stage of the fight. He unleashes a new set of AoE attacks here, but unlike Radahn, these felt more manageable to me and a bit easier to read. Like so many others on this list though, this is just a genuinely fun fight to learn and master. Even though it took me longer than I should have, I still really enjoyed this one. At number 4, and just missing out on the top 3, I'm gonna go with the first main boss of the game, Divine Beast Dancing Lion. This boss definitely set the tone for what was to be expected from this DLC. Man, his attacks are hitting so hard. And like so many bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, he's highly aggressive and requires you to use a variety of strategies to avoid his attacks. I had to dodge, run from side to side or away from him at times, and even jump to finally beat this fight. He has bite attacks, lunge attacks, and some insane lightning attacks when he shifts into his second phase. There's also storm and wind attacks, but he even surprises a third time with ice and snow abilities. He's the first main boss of the game, so there isn't too much here in terms of the build-up, but the overall spectacle and the mechanics of this fight are very solid overall. Oh, and there's also the epic music track here. Honestly, my only main complaints with this fight are the camera and frame rate. On PS5, the frame rate really struggled with some of his attacks that include a lot of the visual effects. And just for reference, I was playing on the high frame rate mode as opposed to the higher fidelity mode. And I have to agree with the camera concerns too. There are times this boss can just get you completely pinned in a corner and it makes it really difficult to manage. So now we move into the top 3 and we're left with Bale the Dread, Messmer the Impaler, and R'hllana the Twin Moon Knight. Honestly, I think I can make a case for any of these three to take the top spot. Let's start with Baal the Dread, a legendary boss with a devastating combination of fire and lightning attacks. But before we even get to Baal, we have to talk about the lead up to this fight as you make your way up to the jagged peak. The atmosphere here is everything. You'll pass numerous dead dragons along the way, and the storm intensifies the closer you get to the top. Once you finally do make it there, you go through the large stone archway into a massive arena, and there's a few moments of ominous silence as you wait for Baal to finally make his entrance. Where's he at? Where's he at? There he is. Baal's attacks are intense, with a lethal mix of fire and lightning, bites, stomps, and tail swipes. It won't be long before you notice that his left leg is completely torn away. Turns out it was actually from a fight that he had with Placidusax, the insane dragon fight we had in the base game of Elden Ring. You'll probably also realize that you can do more damage by attacking that leg. Because of his missing leg, he's more hunched over than other dragons, which often means his head is closer to you. Unfortunately, this is a fight that could definitely cause camera issues for some. Locking onto his head makes tracking some of his attacks easier, but that's the only spot you can lock on with Baal. So your camera will follow all of his head movements, which will make it difficult to maneuver around him to attack the other parts of his body. Unless, of course, you don't lock on, which then makes it more difficult to see what's going on with his head. It's probably one of those fights where you're going to have to get comfortable with locking on and also using the free camera as well. His transition to Phase 2, though, might be one of the most epic phase changes that we've ever seen in any FromSoftware game. And while cutscenes can be cool, to me, there's just something about when it happens right before you on screen in real time. Uh-oh, Phase 2. Get away. Excuse me? What? Baal takes to the skies as lightning strikes from above, all before he comes crashing back down with a new set of attacks to unleash. This phase can feel like pure chaos, as he will attack while on the ground but can just as quickly fly back up again to rain down with bursts of flame. And no, don't worry, I'm not going to forget about our boy, Egon. Even though I don't normally summon for boss fights in these games, I had to break my rule for this one here, just so I could hear. To be fair, as much as I loved having Egon there and wanted him to finish out the story, it definitely did make the fight quite a bit easier. But see, like when he's like this, that's a big help for me. I can heal up, I can do whatever I want, I can just start firing all these. Now, I've listened to a lot of others talk about this fight over the past few days, and I have to say that mechanically, I'm probably not as high on this fight as others. Don't get me wrong, FromSoftware definitely did enough to make Baal feel unique and different from the many other dragons we fought, but at the end of the day, he is still a dragon and has some of the same problems we see in other dragon fights. I think this is especially true if you're fighting him alone without any summons. Now let's consider Messmer the Impaler for the top spot. I guess we shouldn't be at all surprised to see he's one of the best bosses in the DLC, considering how much focus was placed on him ahead of release. By this point, Messmer is an instantly recognizable figure in the world of Elden Ring, thanks to his striking appearance featuring long limbs, massive spear, and the red snake coiled around his body. He is, of course, a mandatory boss in Shadow of the Erdtree and can be found in the massive legacy dungeon known as Shadowkeep. Upon entering Messmer's arena, you'll be greeted by his imposing presence.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death.
He waits no time to attack and immediately unleashes a deadly fireball that requires 2 dodges to avoid. He relies heavily on fire-based attacks and the long reach of his spear. Like many of the bosses in this DLC, staying close is often the best strategy as it helps to minimize his overall reach. He does have a fire grab move that can be an instant kill depending on your level when you fight him. There's also his Messmer's Assault move, which at first can seem almost as daunting as Malenia's infamous waterfowl dance. And while Messmer's move looks absolutely incredible, fortunately it isn't quite as unforgiving as waterfowl. And once you do finally manage to start dodging it, it's just so satisfying. Eventually, once you get his health down to the halfway mark, we get a second cutscene that transitions us to Phase 2. And of course, this dramatic cutscene marks the beginning of what's called Base Serpent Messmer, and here his attacks become even more ferocious. He adds even more devastating fire moves, but it's his new serpent abilities that really change things up here. He starts off with an explosive bite attack where he transforms into a snake and then smashes down with a fireball. But not only that, he can now seamlessly transform into a serpent or even summon additional serpents to attack in a wide range of terrifying moves. And honestly, I feel like getting over that fear and just the horror of what you're seeing in this phase is part of the challenge here. Once I was able to stay calm and really pay attention to the different timings of the serpent attacks, they weren't too difficult to dodge for the most part. Speaking of difficulty, that alone shouldn't make or break a boss fight in my opinion, unless it's just too extreme one way or the other. But for me, I think Messmer is a really well-balanced boss that provides a significant challenge but doesn't feel unfair or too cheap with his moveset. He's really satisfying to learn and completely worthy of the top spot. But before we crown Messmer, we also have to consider Rilana, the Twin Moon Knight and Sword of Messmer. Look, I have to admit, I could be more partial to this fight because of how much I just love magic in these games, but I never focus only on casting. I've always enjoyed running hybrid builds that do some casting but also get up close and personal with swords. So basically, Rilana. She has some of the best looking armor in the game and wields 2 light great swords. Unfortunately, the lead up to the fight isn't all that memorable and she doesn't even get an intro cutscene. There's definitely some interesting lore behind Rilana and her place here in Castle Insis, but you'll only piece it together if you look hard enough. I mean, I guess that's kind of true for most of the lore in this game now that I think about it. Based purely on the fight alone though, this is easily one of the best fights in the game that also feels pretty balanced. It's definitely tough, but her moves don't feel cheap, and it's very satisfying to learn them. She strikes quickly with these sweeping attacks using her light greatswords to deliver rapid, fluid slashes, and it really gives her the appearance as if she's dancing across the arena. She's graceful and fluid, but also able to quickly close gaps or disengage with a single leap. Her combos are long and complex with a mixture of fast and slow strikes to try and keep you from getting too comfortable at any point in the fight. Of course, she mixes up all the melee attacks with magic abilities like Glint Blade Phalanx and Giant Carrion Greatsword. When you get her down to 50% health, she'll seamlessly transition into Phase 2 by powering up her twin blades. And no, it's not as over the top as Bale or Messmer, but to me, I think this one is equally epic, almost because of how just nonchalant she is about it. And the visual effects here are beautiful as you see both of those blades light up. After this, she'll typically launch a Furious Magic combo. And now with these powered up blades, she can also do a new attack using the fire-imbued sword that unleashes a tornado of flames all around her. All I could think about in this fight was getting those swords when I could finally use them for myself. And of course, we can't forget her signature magic spell, the Twin Moons, which actually hits 3 times. I made the mistake of thinking I could run far enough away where these wouldn't hit me, and that's definitely not the case. So the question then becomes, is that enough for Rilana to take the top spot over both Bale and Messmer? If we're basing it on pure spectacle, I'd have to go with Bale, but Rilana stands out as a better fight mechanically, even though Bale is well done for a dragon fight. Messmer though, I think he excels in both areas. The lore, the lead up to the fight, the mechanics, and just the pure spectacle of it all represent FromSoftware's best when it comes to boss design. And for that reason, Messmer the Impaler takes the #1 spot on my top 10 bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. I'd put Rilana at number 2 and Bale at number 3. Now, if you want to see all of my attempts at fighting and finally defeating Messmer, my #1 boss on this list, then check out the video on the right side of your screen now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.